Welcome to the Assembly of Silence Radio Hour.
Okay, folks, here we are. I'm going to try and make the intro really quick. Some of you may have been expecting to hear the second part of the first conversation with Jeff. That's not going to happen. I decided to put it behind the Patreon paywall. So I'm saying thanks to subscribers. Thank you for helping me out because this does take a lot of time and energy. And as it stands, I'm not breaking even. I think it's worth doing. So I'm going to keep doing it. But I'm going to put some stuff behind the paywall every now and then. And that's what happened to the second part of the first conversation with Jeff. It's behind a paywall. So if you want to hear it, patreon.com/TaijiReality. It's in the show notes. And I'm also going to put some links to other ways you can support the program. A crypto link or two, PayPal address. If you just feel like one show is particularly good and you don't really want to support any of the other shows, you can do that. Okay. For this episode, I'm going to introduce a new guest. This new guest is someone who I've known longer than any other guest I've yet had on the program. It's my great pleasure to introduce my friend John, who has been instrumental in opening my mind in a variety of ways. You'll discover that John and I see things quite differently, but nevertheless, it's wonderful to have a conversation with someone who sees things differently, and that is basically what we're doing on the Assembly of Silence, isn't it? Yes? No? Here we go. Hope you enjoy the show.
What I was expecting was based on the conversation we had that led to your inviting me here, which has everything to do with something that we both feel and that I think a lot of people feel, which is that everything has to be transcended in order to meditate clearly with whatever forces are governing humanity and the safety of the earth. And there's a leveling that's going on for those of us who care enough to meditate and are sincere enough about it. That's all part of the Aquarian age situation. There's a leveling in other ways anyway. And so, but the meditative aspect and how that relates to the dawn of the Aquarian age seems to be the general theme. Over to you.
I think that's a really wonderful way to introduce it, and it might be interesting to kind of revisit that conversation that we had last time, which I believe started with a discussion of a lecture on Nietzsche that I had heard, where it was proposed that Nietzsche was essentially saying that the dismal state of the world can only be addressed through an aesthetic approach, something along those lines. And you had some really interesting thoughts about Nietzsche too. So maybe we can revisit that a little bit and then start to talk about, how this gets to a more spiritual practice. Because I don't think of Nietzsche as really being a particularly spiritual thinker, which is strange because he was concerned with that, I think, in many respects. But it seemed as if his thinking was always stuck within a fundamentally materialist point of view. But maybe I'm wrong about that. I'm not a scholar on Nietzsche. I don't know. So let me send it back over to you and see what you say in response to all that.
Okay, I'd have to say that I'm also not a scholar about Nietzsche, but the things that I personally gleaned from Nietzsche over the years and where I go because the work is so vast and complex says as much about me as it does about Nietzsche, because you're absolutely right. He is to the left of what we would consider to be, heart first spirituality. He's a bit of a madman railing against, what's going on, but because his madness embraces philosophical history, and because if you can read him correctly, you can get so much out of him. He's still, you're right. He's absolutely dealing with spiritual issues, but he's dealing from it from a standpoint of religion and philosophy and the way people behave vis-a-vis these much larger concepts that he's trying to explain to us. And he speaks in aphorisms all the time. So what that has to do with our discussion and where it led me is It's possible, except the one other thing that I have to remember you saying that brings it back to our discussion is that he was talking about art. You say aesthetics as meaning it's something to fall back on. And that really is the theme, how much we've changed, because the 19th century, the 20th century, the 18th century, aesthetics and art to me were more meaningful then, because now there's a situation here that's just a little out of control. Over to you.
Yeah, there's an awful lot to unpack there. I guess one of the things that occurred to me was that the characterization of Nietzsche as being someone who's railing against, in air quotes, reminds me of a thread that I was just looking at on Twitter about resistance. So there's this idea that when we see something in the world that we don't like, that we should somehow or another solve that by fighting against it, another air quote thing, And so it seems that in a way, Marx is the same thing. He was so disgusted by capitalism that it basically impelled him to fight against it. And in many respects, it seems that Nietzsche was likewise motivated by the church and sort of religion in general. Although, if I understand correctly, I think Jordan Peterson makes this point, Nietzsche was actually also at the same time recognizing that Christianity was at the foundation of Western civilization, and that if we dispensed with it, we would probably lose our cultural and moral center. And I think that's somewhat been borne out, you could say. So there's an interesting contradiction in these characters who devote themselves to fighting against things that seems to be extremely problematic and somewhat counterproductive, and which might be addressed by this more, let's say, fundamentally spiritual approach that has a more accepting quality of all things, which is essentially what the Aquarian sensibility is. And it might be good to go into a little bit about what's meant by Aquarian. And so that, I think, is maybe one good way to frame the overall conversation, that what we're talking about is an entirely different approach to, quote unquote, solving the problem. And we could say that the great leveling is this event where the problems really get solved, instead of us just kind of fighting against the thing that we didn't like that happened before, that we were that was the oppressive envelope within which we found ourselves when we came into this world. So over to you, because I think that's enough of a mouthful.
That is a beautiful mouthful, especially the way it ended, because it was wise of you to lead us away from Nietzsche and instead compare him with Marx or even Wilhelm Reich, because Wilhelm Reich comes closest to what we want to talk about today in presenting an unarmored, the Uberman is what Nietzsche called him, right? As well, people are standing up and showing their volcanic personalities, and being leaders that way. Whether they were railing against or even when they were uniting people, there's still these, Leonard Bernstein comes to mind, because Leonard Bernstein was so charismatic and helpful and loving. But you still hear the reports, we had this volcanic personality, and suddenly, in the early 21st century, that's a pejorative, all the things to hate about Leonard Bernstein, whereas before that was just all part of the man. He knew how to love, but he also knew how to hate, that kind of thing. There was a romanticization.
A man of passion.
That which is now being just completely trashed, right?
Yeah.
And that's all part of the great leveling, which is why it's wise of us, and anybody who's listening to this, to parse apart these things that we're talking about so that we can indeed be better no-logo diplomats for the 21st century and beyond.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess it may be that every age experiences, at its close, a great leveling. It seems like that would make sense, right? So if we're talking about grand cosmic cycles, then one period moving into another, there is that property of Shiva, where you can't really separate the creative and destructive process. It's one thing is going to have to be destroyed in order for the new thing to come into being. So moving into the Aquarian age, it's interesting to try to get a sense of the character of the Piscean age, because of course Christ was the symbol of the Piscean age. That's correct, right?
That's absolutely correct.
And so the way that I've always interpreted that is, well, I don't know about always, but recently I've been interpreting that as being the moment where mankind realized the necessity for self-sacrifice on a whole new level. You know, the axial age, in some ways, represents the point where civilization got oppressive to the extent that some saw a complete retreat from the world as the only salvation. You know, to live not for this world, which is a more Old Testament way of thinking of things. You know, God would show you favor by bestowing great abundance on you in the material realm. But in Jesus, you're living for the kingdom of heaven. On a basic level, it's denying the material and saying that this is not the real world. We should be living for something far higher than what it is that's going on down here. And so it's odd that what the Piscean age turned into was like the Leonard Bernstein sort of man of great passions, and this bizarre libertine and libertarian individualism that essentially became an incredible engine of greed, you know, rapacious hunger for the material world. In some respects, that follows the Hegelian model, right? Because you have the abstract of the axial age represented in Jesus and Buddha, perhaps, right? Where there's this notion of self-sacrifice or of a detachment from the material that is negated by this ferocious attachment to the material.
Okay.
So, I don't know. Yeah, where do we go from there?
Where we go from there is my sense that prior to Christ, we had an understanding of the duality of things. But that what you're saying, and what I would agree with, is that in a sense what you're saying is that everything that happened that kind of sucks about the last 2,000 years was a reaction to Christ and the Christ head.
Yeah.
That all the right?
Yeah, I mean that I think is that's what Nietzsche was reacting to, was the horror of the result, you know, in the church. You know, I'm my friend and teacher Bala, he pointed out to me at one point that when Jesus changes Simon's name to Peter, he's making a joke. He's saying Simon means one who listens, and Peter means a rock. You know,
Simon's rock.
Simon's rock is that's funny, huh? So what he's saying is that this guy just can't really listen to what I'm saying. So he's like a rock, and upon this rock I will build my church.
Right.
So it's a joke. It's like, you know, he's going like, "Oi, this is the kind of guy who's gonna like bring what I'm trying to do into the future." It's "Oi vey."
Well, here's something personal. I like that you're not wanting to dwell on the personal, but nevertheless, this is such an analogy to what you just said, which is that I'm the only male person in the family. It's the rest are women. It's just down to my mother and my sister. But there's an idealization of my patriarchal role in the family in which I'm supposed to cut as much slack as possible. And it's because I'm the beloved older figure who just will throw up his hands and, you know, in a kind of mock despair when his flock act up or obstreperous in any way. You know, I could be trusted to be, you know, exactly what I've always wanted to make myself out to be, you know, a benevolent person, you know, who believes in a benevolent God. So if I'm going to be in the image of God, I want that to be a benevolent God and to walk my talk. That's all. You know? And so, but nevertheless, so that is tipping over to the positive side, because of course we've had all kinds of wonderful male role models over the last 2,000 years to go by, and people who definitely dipped into the richness of the world at large, from day one, like Goethe or somebody like that. But the Piscean age is indeed been all about bringing us to where we are now, which is not a refutation of the Christ head. The Aquarian age is also Christian, as I'm sure you realize, that the Christ head is it's all about instead of a second coming, having us ascend and the Christ head descend, into a link, so that we're all a bunch of walking, talking, movable, flexible Jesuses who've somehow managed to make the computers just do the work for us instead of what's going on right now, because we're still in crazy.
Well, that's certainly a better vision than what many people are expecting to happen, and I think it's worth cultivating visions that are alternative to the nightmare that's quite often imagined. And I see that as being a possibility. The universalism of Jesus's teaching is central. It's just so obviously one of the primary aspects of his teaching. And it's amazing how often that gets lost within the churches. But I do think that is a fundamental aspect of the Christ head nature, I guess is what you call it. Or I could say of the logos, it's because we're all children of God, so the Holy Spirit is in essence available to all of us, regardless of who we are or our background or even what we've done, because the potential for redemption happens at any moment. It's always available to us in the present. So whatever it is that people have done in the past is an opportunity for learning, so that you can embrace the reality of our unity, which is essentially what the Aquarian age is about. And I think it's obvious that people, at least on a basic level, are now beginning to recognize that this universality is baked into the cake. We're all on one planet, and the planet is now suffering due to our activity.
Yes.
And everything that each of us does has an impact on everyone else and every other species. So we've got to start thinking of things in more universalist Aquarian terms, or we're fucked. And everyone kind of knows it, except for a few holdouts who, insist that whatever they do doesn't matter. There is still a fair amount of that hanging on. And, while there may be some ways in which the interconnectivity is not well understood, I think it's undeniable that everything affects everything. That just seems to be so obviously baked into the reality that we're living in, that the idea that somehow or another you can insulate yourself from that is really the height of arrogance. It's a hubristic act.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's the reason why one of the things Reich railed against was the body armor and the way that it comes out in the leaders and also the little people too, that people who can't take the risk to self-examine and then do what needs to be done to break a pattern, have a brand new day, to make it possible for them to feel from inside out. Because my sense of this whole situation is that people in denial in the, say the energy industry or something like that, need to be enthusiastic. They need to have changes of heart. The great middle will always slog on. And we're seeing that without trying too hard, these things that you're saying, the interconnectedness, is now apparent to people in a way that it wasn't just a few decades ago. Say, the 50s or the 40s. It was all really concrete, all really black and white, and, in places to color in. But now it's just a question of how much this really is the wave motion of the race that we really don't have any control over, and how much we do have control over. But it seems that the evolutionary movement is about giving us more intelligent, conscious control, over ourselves, even though we still have to take in bits and pieces of knowledge in increments, over generations. I mean, the kids growing up today already know things. Take these things for granted in a way that we didn't. There's a lot of things that we've had to discover for ourselves over the decades, and anybody who's really learning and growing is also going to have to do that through their 20s and 30s and onwards up to where we are, which is our 50s.
Yeah, that's interesting. and in some way that suggests that at least some of us did some of the right work, because it means that there was some kind of a basis for them to have a jump on us, that the developmental process was still happening, even though the culture at large was in the grip of the demon of self-aggrandizement and rapacious, conspicuous consumption, right? So, and obviously that's the case, because these conversations have been happening since you and I met, and we've been concerned about all these things our whole lives, even as we're kind of developing our understanding. So I think a lot of us who have been dedicated to this kind of conversation have at times felt as if our efforts were in vain when we look at the society at large. But I think that if it's the case that the younger generations are kind of already have some bases at a far younger age than we did for some of these understandings, then maybe we can say, okay, well, some of the work actually has had fruits, so, by their fruits ye shall know them, right? The thing I wanted to return to briefly, well, maybe this would be good. There's a couple of points that I wanted to discuss a little bit. One is that the great leveling in some ways suggests the resolution of disparity. And, right now we have this outrageous disparity happening within, at the very least, the monetary system. The monetary system is kind of what determines how a lot of other things get played out. And so, the concept of the Grand Jubilee is something that, when was the last time we had one? Let's put it that way. Like the fact of these debts and the fact that, the little people, those who do not have connections to the high levels of the elite classes are punished for their debts, whereas those on the high levels who have created so much damage and caused so much harm to so many people, they actually get bailed out. So not only are, it's a massive Ponzi scheme of debt. And so, but not only does it create this outrageous disparity, but the people who are at the bottom of the pile are the ones who suffer the consequences of it, and the ones who are at the top are always bailed out. So that's, on some basic level, the great leveling that needs to happen is that, in an Aquarian age, all people are people. It's like you're not super special because you managed to accumulate a bunch of credits that were all fabricated and made up, and you had some friends who bailed you out when you made some bad bets, right? It's like, why should those people get to live so much better than the people who work really hard and end up getting completely screwed by this system?
Okay, so here's where I've got something interesting to say, because you've rubbed me up against a dichotomy of my own. You've defined it for me, which is, on the one hand, I can see myself as an incrementalist, but on the other hand, to get to the thing that you're talking about, to that vision, it would seem like it would have to take place, like a snap, there would have to be such a revelation, which would, of course, be contrary to the idea of incrementalism. See what I'm saying?
Say that one more time. I didn't quite get it.
Because, you see, if people could just be people, and this is how we're getting through now. I mean, this is how people always get through. If you watch The Grapes of Wrath or read the novel, but it's very poignant at the end of the film when they're leaving, they're on the road again, and their little, it's got everything's packed up, it's just the middle of the Depression, and they keep rolling on. And she says, well, of course, we are the people, I mean, if you have, and it's the same thing right now, down there, at those border camps, say, there are people who have an attitude, who can take it, and there are people who cannot. It's still the story of people, and it's still the story of man's inhumanity to man, because people are not being treated as people. And so, because the world is so vast and there's so much hatred and so many negative cycles, it would seem like it would take the second coming itself for everybody to just snap out of it and start treating people as people. But that's not really how I think in terms of my everyday politics and the way things go along. Whether I'm totally about incremental changes because that's all I ever see happening. if you catch what I'm saying here.
Well, here's the question then. So, is it possible to have an incremental great leveling?
That's right. Thank you. See, that's why we're having a conversation.
It seems like a contradiction in terms.
And we resolve that contradiction like so many other contradictions that we would love to resolve, and which we do resolve. I mean, that's one of the great things about this, is that I have found myself being able to resolve contradictions. And so this latest one, incremental, how did you put it?
Well, is it possible to have an incremental great leveling? I mean, I think that the argument for incrementalism makes a lot of sense, particularly if you don't want to have a disaster, because large changes generally produce a disaster. But incrementalism tends to just sort of, prop up the status quo. And so we have that problem there. So it seems to me like what we're seeing now is that for every move of incrementalism that's made, there becomes greater indignation on the part of those who want to see substantial change. So, like, take the Democratic Party, for instance. There's more and more people who are like, hey, are you listening? You're the Democratic Party. That means democracy. That means the people in the party might want to be listened to. So it's basically like the Democratic Party won't listen to anyone who makes less than $120,000 a year, right? That it's just they're not listened to. Wow. So Bernie isn't even acceptable, even though he's probably the most popular candidate they've ever had, and he probably would have won the election if they hadn't shafted him in 2016. So the incrementalism kind of produces a more volatile situation. And the Democratic Party, I think, in many respects, is falling apart. It makes no sense. The party itself is attacking its most promising candidates who have the greatest actual popular support.
This is a beautiful place.
In that kind of a circumstance, it's like, okay, if we were incrementally doing the right thing, then, and gradually dismantling the power of those who had taken too much, who were the greater beneficiaries of the age of rapacious greed and self-aggrandizement, if we are gradually loosening that and diminishing their significance and gradually supporting the base, which is why I like Andrew Yang, because I think that in the way the economy is, it's already all funny money, so we can't pretend that it matters whether you're handing people money or if you're just handing corporations money. It's like, okay, well, if you want to balance this thing out, give a little bit to the base, and so that we don't have this outrageous disparity, because the more that the disparity is concentrated, the greater catastrophe it will be down the line. So the great leveling, it seems to me, it's going to have to address those basic issues, and I don't see that the incrementalism that we've had thus far really addressing the fundamental point, because it just always seems to ultimately head in the opposite direction. I mean, we even got a guy who was recognizing the problem in his rhetoric, right? Donald Trump won because he was appealing to the people who had been dispossessed in society, and yet he gets into office and he passes one of the biggest giveaways to the rich in his tax program ever. So it's just...
I'll tell you something, though, about the way this whole thing works from in a larger level, in the level of a huge eye looking down, which is that they see this imaginary set of eyes, how Donald Trump has shaken the whole structure up through his negativity, through his arrogance, his nevertheless is the rock and roll president in reverse, but it's still the same kind of thing. He's a revolutionary. He's made everybody disrespect government. And the truth is, I know all about hypocritical liberals who, if they could be tougher and meaner, would be just as exploitative as Republicans, but they have consciences. So they get into trouble because, they're much more compromised, which is why the left is so much more interesting in terms of its infighting. The infighting on the right at this point is so sad because, the right has never been sadder in that regard. The right has never been sold out in terms of the Christian principles we're talking about, the way it has by Donald Trump. So in the terms of Donald Trump being a radical, revolutionary character, he truly, hello, dog, he truly, is that thing and creates this leveling, because there will be life after Donald Trump, or we'll be picking up the pieces and having to find a new sense of respect and honor post-Trump, not only for ourselves, but for government too.
Okay, so if that sounds like it wasn't the end of the conversation, it's because it wasn't. What happened at that moment is I got interrupted by someone who needed my attention. And we picked up the conversation a little while later, and it went on for a long time, and I was thinking about, well, I've got to break this up into 2 sections. How am I going to do it? And this was just the natural place to do it. So I may end up offering the second half to the general public on the main feed, or I may end up making it available only to subscribers only. I really don't know at this point. We're going to find out in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for listening. We look forward to serving you again soon. In the meantime, remember, turn that thing over a few times before you pick it up and take it home.